Whoa, there is nothing better than the smell of manure in the morning. Coming to you live to tape from Central Valley of California, the land called Paradise, San Diego, California, outside the city of Milwaukee, and from the Peace Garden State, bordering our neighbors to the north, we bring you our own little voluntary association known as the FOPS, or Friends of Publius, to our fifth episode of the Constitution in American Life. So this week in history, in the year 2002, George W. Bush labeled North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as the axis of evil, as a prelude to war with Iraq. But maybe more important, it is this week in the year 1845 that The Raven is published in the Evening Mirror in New York, the first publication with the name of the author, Edgar Allan Poe, one of my favorite high school authors, or reads when I was in high school there. So in this episode, we are going to be addressing an idea developed by no one's favorite Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, and that is the importance of voluntary associations to civic life in the United States. Does his classic work, Democracy in America, reflect the attitudes of average Americans or the elites? Did America truly utilize voluntary associations more than anywhere else in the world in the 1830s? What about today? Were voluntary associations the antidote for the extremes of democracy? And are voluntary associations just a more simplistic phrase for factions? We hope to address these questions and more in the following discussion, addressing the Unit 6 topic from the We the People National Questions. So as I like to do often, let's start with Professor Moore, who disdains presentism, by asking him to address the 19th century topic, which is still too present for him, but he'll have to suffer through it. So Professor Moore, just who is this guy, Alexis de Tocqueville, and what is the enduring significance of his work, Democracy in America?
Wow, there's some real you got some issues here, David. I mean, come on now.
I got issues. You finally figured that out, or you've known that and just been silent about it for a few decades?
I mean, Alexi's not here to defend himself, so I guess that befalls me.
Well, there's a standard for a historian.
Yeah. Yeah, de Tocqueville is he's amongst many European intellectuals that come to the United States in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Europe got, well, honestly, David, you know as well as anybody else that Europe got quite fascinated with the revolution too. And there was a lot of European young kind of second tier military folks who were coming to America to you know, pad their resume so they could go back home and get some cred. But he's a part, I would describe him as being a part of a long tradition of Europeans showing up to the United States for various reasons, to just kind of take a look around. And he was born into wealth. He's from an aristocratic family. By all accounts, though, he wasn't particularly a pretentious aristocrat. He had some misgivings about the class system. He was born right in the middle of the Napoleonic terror. And when the Bourbon monarchy collapsed in, I think, the 1830s, he was not particularly upset about that. He kind of held out this view that a restoration of the monarchy in France would not go well, which I think some people kind of make him into a small d Democrat in that regards. But he comes here ostensibly to study prison reform. Remember, this is an era of American history where there was a lot of reform movements. This is the antebellum America, where we as a nation got real interested in scrubbing up society, and prison reform was one of those things. So that's what he comes to study, and he travels around all over the United States, although he does spend a bit more time up in New England. And that's one of the critiques of de Tocqueville, that he kind of centered his whole analysis of American democracy and was colored by the New England town hall meeting dynamics. Um, he oddly enough, he came with other people. He was to write on prison reform. The other folks that were with him were charged with analyzing other facets of American society, but he soon kind of abandoned that project and wrote the two-volume version of Democracy in America. Why he's significant? That's a little more, I think, an interesting actually debate, because some people want to make him into being a conservative, and some people want to make him into a liberal, small d Democrat. I'd suggest there's quite a degree of ambivalence about in Tocqueville as to whether I don't think you can make him into either, but I think his appeal to Americans, even to this very day, I mean, more recently, folks like Putnam have, everybody's kind of like the new Tocqueville. And so I think one of the enduring attractions of Tocqueville is he spots this decentralization trend in American history. And he shows up in a very tumultuous, in my estimation, a very politically tumultuous time. I think he also has this luster of the accurate outside observer. I mean, Crevcoeur was here during the American Revolution and made all kinds of observations about America as well. And occasionally Americans kind of dig that when the outsiders show up and analyze our culture. And I mean, it's encyclopedic. Democracy in America is. He analyzes so many facets of America. I think he also is, he has an enduring attraction for some because he actually, if he is suspicious about democracy, and I think he is to a degree, he warns Americans about the possibility of despotic democracy and demagoguery. And there's some wonderful, and I personally, I think that has a lot of prescience, like right now, if I could step into a little presentism there. I also think the attraction is, I think I said this before, liberals can glom on to parts of democracy, and I think conservatives can as well. So I think, for those reasons, he still has an attraction to Americans. Plus, he's on everybody's syllabus in college courses. If not the full book, I wouldn't recommend that. But yeah.
Well, that may be true for you and I, but if I'm to understand correctly, is that more recently in the so-called academy, he's not getting as much coverage. That people have gotten a little lukewarm on
Well, sure.
Tocqueville.
And I think it has some suspicions about his aristocratic analysis. I mean, so I think, and he was a wealthy person. He came from wealth, so I think there are some suspicions amongst some that his analysis really was kind of a kind of a code language for the elite. I mean, Burke called them, I think, the little platoons, I think, is a phrase that Burke used all the time to describe these French aristocrats that would gather together and form agendas in this political vacuum that so much of early 19th century France had. So there is some suspicion about his aristocratic leanings, I think, which puts him under the microscope for some.
Well, Professor Kavanaugh, there's the element about Tocqueville and his aristocratic background, and I came across some material that criticized Tocqueville because they argue that his portrait of the United States overwhelmingly reflects the views of political, social, religious, economic elites and not the common man. Would you agree with those critics and with that conclusion they have? And is that important for students to understand? All right, as far as his influence as a writer.
I would say he did spend in his time here, probably if you on a pie chart it out, and much more time with hobnobbing with the elites. Holy smokes, he spent time with John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jack. I mean, he was rubbing elbows with power brokers of the day, but he also got to see some things, though. I mean, he got to see like part of the Native American removal from Georgia. He got to see a caning of an enslaved man. So he got to see some of the ugliness. I'm not sure that he spent a lot of time with John Q. Public, though. So I think that's a fair criticism, Dave, that, his view may be a little skewed, but he did get to see a lot of things in his travels. And what was he, 26, something like that, 26 years old? So he's a young man when he's doing this. So yes, he spent an inordinate amount of time with the upper crust. I would say that's a given, but still think that he got to see enough that to have a solid view. But I'm going to go back to something Tim said too. When you're spending time in New England and that whole time of when we'll talk about voluntary associations and you have the town hall meetings. So that's what he saw a great deal of. Does it affect students? Is it something students should? Well, absolutely, because he's here in the 1830s, and as Tim said, it's kind of tumultuous. It's the age of Jackson. It's states are doing away with voting property requirements for voting, and so you start to see a movement there. You see some continuing ugliness of American politics with Andrew Jackson and those opposed to him. So it's always good for students to understand the context in which someone is writing. The idea that we can take Tocqueville and plug him into 2024, there's a danger there. And even I was checking out a book that we're all familiar with, How Democratic is the American Constitution, by Robert Dahl, and I'll put a link to this in the resources. And Dahl takes him to task for sure in terms of his misguidedness. So it's important for students to always understand the context. Michael?
Yeah, I don't disagree with this. I'm just wondering, would we do the same sort of critique with the Federalist Papers? I mean, the French looking over at us, Hamilton and Madison and Jay, they're aristocrats. And how much do they know about what the common man and woman is thinking? So could that critique go both ways?
Well, yeah, but
that's an absolutely fair point. But being a fairly, I'm steeped in that time period, there's a lot more discourse going on other than Publius and Brutus. I mean, there is a lot of lowbrow discussion during ratification. So all that to say is there is an element of the common, a healthy dose of the common man involved in the ratification debates. Now, they're not writing Fed 10, but they are articulating, they're a part of that national discussion. So, John Q. Public, I think, at least in the ratification, is actually involved. And I think, the Jacksonian era, I mean, the way I remember reading it, there's a lot of common man. I mean, newspapers are really, really taking off and really salt of the earth stuff. So I think I'd push back slightly on totally deconstructing Tocqueville.
Mike, you want to rebut that?
No, go. You rebut it. You say something. I have something else.
I'm not going to rebut. I'm actually going to reinforce them, especially talking about newspapers in the mail. I mean, Tocqueville's writing about that and access to print and to the mail to be able to share these ideas, which he writes about that, and it's distinctive on this continent compared to what he came from in Europe. Yeah. So it's interesting he would include the mail in that, but as well as the printing press. I mean, that was a big deal. Yeah. It's like he said, the gun on the battlefield gave the soldier the equity on the battlefield. So in lies the print journalism as well as the mail here.
Well, Mike, and I just before you add on to that, or is that it seems to me that we can put Hamilton and Madison in the same box, or Tocqueville in the same box with Hamilton and Madison. That the critiques of the Federalist Papers are similar to the critiques of Tocqueville. Is that they seem to defend and reinforce the anti-democratic, aristocratic nature of the American Constitution and political culture. And so it is a top-down view of which to me, the Constitution is a top-down arrangement, of constitutional structure and such. So I see a consistency there. So go ahead. I'm sorry, Mike. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Tim's on the edge of a seat. Then I'll chime in. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, as I read Tocqueville, I guess I see an ambivalence about democracy. I don't, or an ambivalence about European classism too. I guess I'm not buying, I'm not willing to totally deconstruct him, because I think there's a fair amount of ambivalence about both his experience as well as the American experience.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. I just add that I agree with some of these critiques, maybe not as fully as Tim's articulating, but I agree with the critiques. But I always tell my students what I like about Tocqueville is like he's a comparativist, right? And I really do think there's a power in, like, we don't see a lot of things in our culture because we're swimming in the water. And it takes for an outsider to kind of see some things that we don't see. Now, to criticize him based on maybe he didn't see as much as he should, like that maybe he was too much New England, not enough Mississippi, that's fair. I don't know if the criticism about his status, because either he observed what he observed, right? And I think that he's from even the fact that we're using this term aristocracy so much with him, and we never use that with the founders. We talk about elites. I mean, it has this extra sort of, my ears, it's like pejorative. It's like, oh, he's an aristocrat. So it's a little othering to me, like we're putting him up to a mantle, or subjecting him to a standard that we don't always subject all the other elites that we talk about on this show.
I disagree with you. We have used, and we've had, in fact, a program on aristocracy. I just think it's the difference between historians and political scientists. Historians use that's just my simple view there, Professor Williams, on that. Chris, you were going to jump in.
Well, I was going to push back on Tim. I don't know if I would use the word ambivalent towards democracy, because I think he's playing it out. I mean, what he's seeing here in terms of and really, I think at the heart of it, I think it comes back to land, because land and the availability of land is a great leveler here for so many people. They grant access. And I think he's, talking about the fear, where he writes about majority tyranny. So I'm not sure that ambivalent is the word I would use towards democracy.
So, Professor,
I mean, the last chapter is, I guess I'm camping out on his last chapter, where he does say, this could go sideways, and I don't read his work as a suggestion for other places to emulate either. So
I would agree with that. I think he's just recording what he sees, but he's also the fear that that very fear that it could go sideways.
Yep.
So, Professor Williams, let's target the question specifically now that we've dealt with Mr. de Tocqueville here in some detail.
We trashed him enough.
Yeah. What are voluntary associations according to Tocqueville? And if indeed America utilized voluntary associations more effectively than the rest of the world in the mid-19th century, how do you account for that? Why is that a truism, if indeed it is?
Yeah, okay. So the first question is, my reading of Tocqueville is that voluntary associations are individuals coming together for a shared purpose, to advocate for a civic or publicly minded issue. He says specifically about this adherence to the public. So he's thinking about something other than groups just coming together for their own self-interest. I think he's leaning into some classical republicanism, I think, but I'm happy to get some pushback on that. And he's really impressed by this combination of individualism and equality that he thinks he sees in America, how everyone equally can join these groups. Now, of course, the alarm bells are already going off with our students watching this, right? Of all the things that he's missing with that. Native Americans, women, slaves, free African Americans, the whole bit, right? But that's what he's going to say. So that's what voluntary associations are, and I think we're going to talk a little bit later about is that just a faction or not. But that's what he'd say they are. He does also say that what he's comparing to is he's looking at Europe, and it's not that voluntary associations don't exist in Europe, but he sees them as much more divisive and much more inclined to use force to get their way rather than use some sort of like peaceful persuasion or petitioning of government. So I think that's what he's really impressed with, is how Americans are coming together and they're using this as a way to get whatever concerns they want on the table. He also says that this works in conjunction with universal suffrage. This idea that people can vote, and that he calls it like this, the majority has a moral, he says the majorities have a moral essence to them. So your job, if you're in a group, is that you need to convince the majority of your opinion, like that they should agree with you so that you can adopt this, rather than using force or using military tactics to get it. So that's what he's going to see is different than what's going on in Europe. To the extent is, so I'll go on to the second question now. To the extent that is the United States exceptional? I guess that's kind of the whiff of the question in the 1830s and 40s. I think my computer doesn't allow me to search for things that are too historical. I think I just have a general kind of block on it. So, well, but yeah, seriously, the data is kind of hard. The data is kind of hard to find on this, right? But I would say, thinking back, and this is where Tim and Chris and Dave, you guys all chime in on this, please. The United States at this point is clearly like one of just a few countries in the world experimenting with something of having a First Amendment, even if it wasn't all the way with the states yet, even if it wasn't being enforced, having some sort of suffrage, having some sort of idea of the people are governing through consent. I think all those things, along with what Chris said about the availability of property, there's like a burgeoning, it's not a middle class yet, but people have time to discuss issues in ways that you're not going to find in a lot of places in Europe or a lot of places in Africa and Asia at this point. So I don't have a resource to share with the students that shows, yes, there were more voluntary associations in the US at this time than other places, but I think we can infer that that's probably the case, just given the structural dimensions of what we had created at the end of the 18th century, right, in terms of our form of government.
I would agree that again, after trying to prepare for today, that property and the availability of land really distinguishes us from our European brethren. Not to go all Frederick Jackson Turner on it, but that by having that property, you have a vested interest in how that society is going to run. What did Tocqueville call us? He called us a nation of joiners. I think that's one of the ways he described us. But I would take exception with the question, the way it's phrased on the national questions. I don't know that, did he say that we were better than everybody else in terms of our voluntary associations in his actual work?
The way I read it, no, I see an ambivalence. He's just describing it. I mean, there is some optimism there, but the deeper you go into the entire work, I think the ambivalence starts to come through. And Mike's point about he looks at these organizations that Americans join, and a lot of commentators have noted that Tocqueville has this notion that these organizations that these Americans join are kind of like secondary. They're not primary. In other words, what we do, according to Tocqueville, we join these groups, and it's almost like a Madisonian winnowing, that when we join these groups, we're not going to get everything we want. And these groups, at least in Tocqueville's mind, function to kind of ameliorate some of the harder edges or the more straight up selfish interests. And I think that's an interesting observation. Now, whether that's true or not, it's a fair debate. But he sees this tempering of excessive, and I think that's the key to understanding self-interest rightly understood, that the secondary nature of these groups will kind of lessen this hard-edged, selfish, pure self-interest.
I agree with that. And I think where other scholars have picked up on that is that having these kind of cross-cutting cleavages, like that they had more than, there was just not one self-interest. Like you went through life with, like we all do, with self-interests. It's a plural. And so if I'm meeting with my church group, part of the time there's a self-interest there, then I'm meeting with the group in terms of thinking about farming. At some point, you're right, Tim, there's going to be like, well, I can't get everything. And I know the church people may be against this farming thing, but I like, I can see their point of view. So let's try to compromise. And the more we move away from that to get into presentism, the more we can divide ourselves into to less camps, so to speak, right? Or just to see a dichotomy of an either or, that opportunity to empathize or even compromise kind of goes away.
I mean, that's why I would caution students to not make the analogy that when Tocqueville's talking about these groups that the Americans would join, that's the same as modern day special interest groups. I think Tocqueville, I don't know that, I'm pretty sure he's not describing that kind of a grouping that we see today.
Maybe it's so hard to say, because obviously, we're looking with our lens on today, but I mean, as I understand what Tocqueville, when he's talking about self-interest rightly understood, is that really you have a stake in making sure society runs well, and because that way you're more likely to achieve what you need. So you have a stake in making sure that your neighbor is necessarily is heard in an issue. So the idea is that society's got to run well for you to achieve what you need to achieve as an individual. And when we go down that, I mean, this is really his question. What he deals with is an age-old question, that debate between equality and liberty, right? It's just that it's the whole nature of equality versus liberty. So to enjoy the best liberty, you have to have equality. I think this kind of part of his argument.
I guess I think your use of the word society, Chris, to me is fundamental here, because I think the reason I'm camping out I'm harping on this, I wouldn't make the linkage to special interest groups, is because they generally are political. They want political outcomes. I mean, it seems to me Tocqueville's describing some of that, but he's also, to your point, he sees a lot of these social gatherings and groupings that aren't straight up political the way I think we view special interest groups today. So that's why I was kind of tempering that linkage.
I would also, I don't know, I'd have to think about that more, but I do think that the scope of the state in the 1830s and 40s is such that it's just not, I mean, I read Tocqueville as like, Putnam would say, this is just trying to solve the collective action problem. Like, how do we get together as a group and solve our basic day-to-day problems, with the assumption that the big government's not going to come and fix it for us, right? We're going to have to figure this out on our own. So it necessitates kind of a working together in a way that you're describing, Tim, that's different than special interest in lobbying is just going to the state and asking them to solve the problem for you. And there's a collective action problem to get people together to do that, for sure. but you can solve that through just having more money than the next person, right?
Yeah.
And just getting the whole that way.
Well, Tim, and I probably, Mike, I should have given a little bit of context because I was working off, I think, some of the same definition that you were, that there's a public mindedness to this association. I do like, and I don't know if we'll have a chance maybe to make a link if there is one to classical thinking, but also this juxtaposition versus, Europe, and that they exist there, but they tend to use force. And when I was reading that, I was thinking about what the book Tim has referenced the last couple episodes, that he's reading about mid 19th century America and the violence. And I forget the title of it, but it's something about blood there. And
Feel the blood.
yeah,
Congress to feel the blood.
how accurate is that these voluntary associations are peaceful, civic minded groups kind of stuff. And I was trying to wrap my head around that when Tim's describing this violence and blood at the same time period.
That's the political. I mean, that's my point. That's the political realm, and I think Tocqueville is observing a lot more than just the political outcomes of associationalism.
Okay, yeah, he might be drawing that fine line, but this is my struggle with that, is, to me, whether it be social, economic, or whatever, there's still a political end involved in these associations there, right?
Not necessarily.
Not in no, I think that's I would push back on that, because I believe that there is such a thing. I firmly believe that it should be a vibrant private sector and private associational behaviors. I'm not a statist in that regard.
Okay, so I guess maybe building a bridge, it seems that Tocqueville, Tim, presents the argument that America's voluntary associations provide the right antidote, all right, to the idea of too much democracy, which you guys have referenced, and individualism, and too little democracy expressed by centralized authority, which is a lot of Europe at that time. Would you agree with that assessment of the role of voluntary associations? Is that they help act as a buffer between these extremes of political society?
Yeah, I do. And that assumes that he's proposing the winnowing and taking the rough edges off of straight up naked self-interest. I mean, he really does stress that there is a tempering that takes place in these associations. So I think if he's saying that, and I think that's an accurate way to see his perspective on what these associations are, they will cure the excesses of self-interest. That's again the rightly understood piece that would hey, sit down a minute, Mike. You can't get all of that, and you're a little out there, and you got to play in the sandbox. And so if his view of associations is that secondary, what scholars have called that secondary association function, I think it does cure the excesses. But again, he warns about the American democracy is just always a half step from democratic demagoguery too. So, and he's seeing the excesses of Jacksonian democracy too, with all these my people, these crazy Irishmen running around beating people up for whatever reason. So, but I do think if they are this linkage, but it also not only just a linkage to government, but also a tempering within the group, I think it is.
And I just to add on to that, I mean, he talks about like these groups come together, they're publicly minded, whether that's politics, like we can debate like what we mean by that. But he says that they're to proceed, and it's quote, in a certain manner. And what some scholars have dug in on this, if they said, look, doesn't want anti-civil or uncivil behavior, right? Which I think if we think about self-interest going too far, maybe that's getting in terms of like you get together, you're getting together for you want to take some collective action. I think Tocqueville is trying to remind us that the way you take that action matters. And I think, Tim, that gets to your point, whether that's a an easing up on just how strident you're going to be
Yeah.
to get what you want, that you have to play within some larger norms, right?
Well, it seems to me that's I think that's a part, maybe in part or parcel, the critique of Tocqueville, that he's an elitist who wants things done in he doesn't want all this hurly-burly, lowbrow, out of control stuff. So I think that may play into the critique of Tocqueville.
Well, Chris, and part of me is, I guess I need to clarify what I think I've heard, and from the panel here is my question to you, Chris, is to what extent in America, excuse me, to what extent, if any, can voluntary associations pose a threat to constitutional democracy? But the clarification I need is, it seems to me that you guys are saying there is little or no similarity between these voluntary associations and what Madison called factions. Is that my understanding, that there's not, they're apples and oranges?
No, I think there are different types of apples. I think they're,
I like that. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, because Madison's definition of faction in Fed 10 is a majority minority of the people brought together by common interest or passion, and they're going to pursue that common interest or passion regardless of how it may affect the common good. See Ku Klux Klan, right? I mean, is a Klan a faction? Yeah, absolutely. Neo-Nazis. So I guess depending on can these voluntary associations be good things? Oh, of course they can. But can they be negative? Of course they can. So do they fall into the realm of factions? Yeah, I think they do. So
Tim or Mike, just on that issue, are we with Chris now on that?
I'm always with Chris.
Yeah.
I think that's the beginning of a faction. All right.
I know. Well, I'm always the odd man out. I really feel devalued every week in this group. But I don't. I think there is an element of factional thinking here. But I think now, whether he's naive or not, Tocqueville believes that there's a tempering and a winnowing, lessening of the hard edges of self-interest. Now that could be, we can talk about whether that's naive or not in his point, and whether he's using kind of a European or aristocratic gloss on what he hopes these to be. But I do believe there is a connection there. I just wouldn't, I would hesitate to say it's all a political factionalized type thinking.
Okay, I think the students, like, this is you should really dig into this faction voluntary association. I think there's like a lot more thinking to do on this. I think it's tricky, Dave, because the question that Madison is asking and trying to answer is so much different than Tocqueville's. Like, Madison is trying to make the anti-federalists feel okay with the fact that we're going to have this large republic, and that is going to be okay. Their rights are not going to be sacrificed in this, right? Because you're going to have these factions competing with each other. Tocqueville, I think, sees it a little differently. Tocqueville says the magic of the next step after voting is, what do you do between elections? Well, you join together and you try to then convince the majority of what you want. It just seems like they're asking different questions and they're seeing the role of groups a bit differently. So maybe Chris is always right, but maybe he's really right on this, that we're talking about Fuji apples and Gala apples or something. Is Gala an apple? I don't know.
Yes, Gala apples are great. They're the best, by the way.
Okay. Well, I like Fuji.
Well, the other thing too is, I think, and when Tocqueville's looking at things, I mean, because I think at that time frame, with the explosion of more political rights, but also clearly back to property again, got to feel like Madison and Fed 10. But you're going back to this, and so we're like that kid at Christmas that's got the new toy, and that new toy is to be able to get involved in our society. And so we're joining all these different kinds of associations or clubs or things like this, and not all of them are politically motivated. One of my favorite is in New Harmony, Indiana, with the site of a failed social experiment. They had the Minerva Society, and it was a women's club, and that was in the late 1820s into the early 1830s. And they're the first women's club in America with a constitution, and they're debating topics like which is a greater evil, slavery or war. So they're coming together just for these types of things, not necessarily to push an agenda, what we tend to think of with our modern view of factions today. They're not necessarily political. And I want to underscore what Tim was saying, when Tocqueville's saying this, because we have so many of these voluntary associations, some are there for economic benefit, some are there for political benefit, some are those just go out and hang out with friends and discuss things without necessarily putting forth an agenda.
So
So
so these are what common man salons?
Yes, the Granger movement. I mean, they obviously have an economic agenda too, but very early, the Grangers, they were like a social gathering. The Chautauqua speaker would come through. There was all kinds of stuff that was not political. So, yeah, I think they are like the common man salons. That's a great way to think about it. Yeah.
So that pretty much makes my direct question to you, Chris, silly and stupid, because how could common man salons pose any danger to constitutional democracy? So these voluntary associations aren't factions, and therefore they can't pose a danger.
no. I mean, because if you think of Madison's definition of a faction, I mean, they're brought together by a common interest or passion. It's just that not every one of these groups or these associations that Tocqueville is seeing is moving beyond the four walls of where they might be meeting. Some are not. Some do have long range ideas, and some of them, whether they be political or economic, may want to pursue certain things regardless of how that affects the common good, falling in line with Madison's definition of factions. But some are just people hanging out.
Mike, do you have something on this? No.
No.
So what I'm wondering, Professor Williams, is Tocqueville claims that voluntary associations have been utilized more effectively in America than anywhere else, which we kind of talked about. We'll assume that's true in the 1830s. Is that true today? Do you think that if we do a comparative analysis, as Tocqueville, I found it interesting, you called him a comparativist, would that be true of America today?
Yeah, there's a bunch of research on this, and it trends towards kind of what Putnam pointed out, 25, 30 years ago, that no, we don't join as much as we did in the past, and compared to other democracies, most Americans aren't involved with as many associations. So I can share in the resources a couple articles looking at European countries and the United States and Australia, and we're above average, but the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, people tend to join more. What's also interesting is that it's not just about joining, right? It's about, a lot of the research on this is like this benefit of joining a group, and it's this notion of social capital. This notion that by joining groups, you get more trust is the idea. You learn about generalized reciprocity. It's just going to make you a better small d democratic citizen to belong to groups. But not all groups are created equal, and there are groups that do more bonding and those that do more bridging. So bonding groups are groups that are going to be a little more exclusive, like church groups. Church groups are really good about bringing people together of certain religions or certain denominations, but they're not really good about bridging to other religious factions or to other types of groups. So we definitely fall behind in terms of the groups that we're joining in terms of bridging, right? That's what the research shows. And there's been some scholars who've tried to measure social capital on a global scale. And the United States on some of these measures shows up way in the middle of the pack in terms of how much we trust each other, how much we are willing to be generalized reciprocity, where it's like you're doing favors just not because you're getting something in return, you're just doing a favor because that's what you do with this group that you're in. So I think Putnam, Putnam was really the first that kind of like, I don't know, bring back Tocqueville in the 1990s. And there's been a lot of research after Putnam to like try to test his arguments. And for the most part, Putnam's findings are holding up, that we're not as likely to be as much joining as we did in the past. And the type of joining we're doing isn't really as good for social capital.
Well,
Yeah, the book is The Bowling Alone is the book.
well, where are we with Putnam? Because I remember after 9/11, he kind of did a small mea culpa, in the year after. Didn't I mean? I thought he wrote an article and said, "Oh well, maybe yeah, these associations are still alive and well." I'm just wondering, has that been revised again, and he's back to his original thesis in Bowling Alone?
Not he actually. I think there's a book that he wrote just a few years ago. Gosh, I don't. I've got it sitting in.
It's called Upswing, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of like I keep thinking of like I want to call it The Kids Are All Right, about youngsters, younger people moving forward with these things. And Tim just said this for the students watching. It was published in 2000. It's called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. See, Harvard or Yale.
I think he's a Harvard guy.
Harvard, yeah.
But the whole premise of the book was the idea that Americans used to join all types of civic organizations or the bowling leagues for that matter. And so just by bowling, with your friends in a league night once a week or every couple of weeks, you build up this term that Mike alluded to, which is social capital, which is an investment in your community, which I think goes back to Tim's whole idea about Tocqueville ameliorating the hard edges of things because you're belonging to these multiple organizations. And by belonging to these multiple organizations that are not necessarily politically or economically motivated, they're just civically motivated. And you're there and you understand the people within your community, you build up this social capital. And we don't, and Putnam's view is we've moved, and again, that was published 24 years ago, so that we've moved away from that.
And there's the whole technology piece too. I know Sunstein wrote a book a while back called Republic.com. He had great suspicions about technologies. I mean, when in the 90s, it was going to bring us all, it would facilitate community. And Sunstein he kind of took that to task. There's a fantastic book I just finished a couple weeks ago. I'm riffing on Chris Kavanaugh right now. I got a book to share. And I'll put the link in the sources as well. But Norina Hertz is on this technology critique, that technology really has not brought us the ability to do connectedness, and it actually is destroying social capital, not creating. So there's a lot of commentary on how technology it works against these associationalism.
Yeah. Well, that was one of Putnam's main findings in Bowling Alone, except he was looking at televisions and arguing that we're spending too much time in front of televisions. And that was one of the things that was bringing down us joining groups.
So before we get to our wrap up, I guess I need some clarification a little bit. So
is there another guest here that can provide that?
Well, again, you guys point out that Tocqueville says that individualism and equality kind of in America kind of goes together, that democracy is enhanced by the connectivity of those two principles. Yet I'm rereading Kermit Roosevelt's book, and he seems to present the antithesis of that, saying that in America, individuality, unity through unity through tribalism and individualism within that is the antithesis or rejects equality. That the history of America is that we constantly reject equality in favor of tribal individualism there. So how do you guys see that? I mean, Tocqueville's notion that those two things go together just doesn't seem as a reflection of America in the 1830s or pretty much at any time in our history.
But I think it goes to Chris's point that what are the, I think your question was kind of what are the limits of associationalism? And Chris's point was, well, sometimes it can go off the rails. It can get so myopic and so narrow. And I think Chris's answer was kind of in cultural terms that you can get to fascism. That you can be so insular in all these others that exist outside your associational groupings. So I think I think Chris's point's well taken that this associationalism does have the tendency and can be that way. And that maybe is the weakness of associationalism and not having a large public, clearly defined public interest.
Well, I think too that, and we kind of what we said is that with Tocqueville is really that age-old issue between equality and liberty, right? Yeah. And so when you have that, when you think of you're promoting this idea of equality, but you also have freedom or liberty, if you will, you know, and he warns about majority tyranny, and I think that's at heart going back to the idea of you can be careful with that, you have to be careful with that, but back to the idea of voluntary associations, by doing these things, Tim said this, you take off the hard edge, which allows for perhaps a greater, you know, back to the learned hand, the spirit of liberty is, you know, the idea is like, you know, good for me, not good for you, not good for me, good for you. So you allow that space for people to exist. And by allowing that space for people to exist, therein is that enlightened self-interest, because it moves society forward, which will in turn move me forward. So it really is a balancing, I think.
I do think that, David, to your point, I mean, Tocqueville's given us a snapshot, right? And he's given us a snapshot that is kind of, it's limited on what we've already talked about, what he could see, what he doesn't really discuss. I mean, in terms of the inequality in the United States. And so I think he's leaning into this notion that he sees this political or like public sphere equality that he doesn't see in Europe. Because Europe has all these divisions between the nobles and the common, right? He doesn't see that. And in fact, one of the things he mentions because he does write a report on prisons, he does do that. And one of the things he says in there that he finds remarkable is that and again, we can take him to task about maybe he didn't see it all, is that no matter who you are in the United States, when you go to the prison, it's the same kind of prison. That in Europe, you would never put someone of a higher rank in the same prison as other people. And he observes in the United States that there's this like, everyone's in the same prison together. So I think that's what he's seeing, but I think I think that what Kermit Roosevelt's getting at is that as an idea and maybe as a snapshot, maybe we can see that, but as an ongoing practice, as a lived experience, we Americans have constantly come up short of what we think that ideal should be between equality and individualism. And the final thing is that, you know, if you take away this line between the public and private sphere, you could ask yourself, okay, well, how much does private inequality hurt your chances to be involved in the public sphere, right? If you're surviving day to day, and you're just thinking about where are you going to get a meal, where are you going to find shelter, you don't have the time or resources to join in the public sphere, even though you have that right to do so. So I don't think Tocqueville, his analysis doesn't get close to that, because I think he's really focused on the public sphere and he's also missing a lot. So I think that's what Roosevelt is offering, a more of like, what have we done in practice? And this is how these ideas fall short to the practice.
But what I think is fascinating, and I've not had time to flesh this out, is to think about, I know we've talked about Fed 10 and factions, but I would go back to Fed 10 and property, you know, and the whole idea, what according to Madison and Fed 10, that's the goal of government, is to protect the differences in property, right? And where now you fast forward to Tocqueville, where more people have property, which opens up doors to them politically and economically. So there's this great leveling effect, and Tocqueville writes about this after he writes about voluntary associations. He talks about, you know, you don't have the misery that you had in Europe, so you may not have the finery aristocrats had, but it's better for people here. Fast forward then to like maybe 60, 55 years after democracy in America, and go to Carnegie and his essay on wealth. And it's really interesting. I don't know what that line is. Like, I don't know if I can connect all the dots, but it's fascinating in terms of, because Carnegie in his essay on wealth is that, well, it's better for some to have everything than nobody have everything. So his defense of this capitalist society that has developed, which of course made him like the second wealthiest man in America. And just a little side note, which I found fascinating. Um, uh, Tocqueville writes something else that publishes in 1848. It's called The Old Regime and the Revolution.
Yeah.
And something else comes out in 1848 is Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto.
Yep,
So it really is interesting to think about these two different political philosophers, because Tocqueville's The Old Regime and the French Revolution is about that inequality, especially with property, especially with wealth, which leads to revolution. And then, of course, here's Marx saying, yep, it's coming, buddy. It's coming.
Well, 1848, it's there in Europe.
Yeah, it's all over Europe, right?
It's all over Europe in 1848. So, gentlemen, let's bring this to a conclusion, and it's our tradition to provide final insights and recommendations to students and teachers as they prepare for the Unit 6 question and Alexis de Tocqueville. So, Professor Williams, final thoughts.
Yeah, I would, and I'm going to borrow something that Tim brought up, but I would have you all to think about the role of technology. I think that you're definitely, you're getting you're going to get a certain biased understanding of how technology can form associations or create trust or create networks of norms, right? With the four of us. But I think it's worth you thinking through your own experience with technology in terms of forming groups and relating back to what Tocqueville said were the things about groups that were really good for democracy, and just asking whether you see any kernel of that in any of the way you use your digital groups. And maybe there are certain platforms that you think are really much better than others. I'm not sure if this is research or whether I just heard this on the radio, but that I guess LinkedIn is apparently a platform that a lot of people are saying is really good about building up some social capital versus other types of platforms. And so maybe you might have some insights on that, or maybe you want to think of ways of what a digital platform would look like that would generate these sorts of features that we've been talking about for the last hour.
Isn't that what Facebook was supposed to do?
It was supposed to do it, yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm not on any platform, so
yeah. Zuckerberg is no James Madison.
Okay, Professor Moore, your final thoughts beyond Zuckerberg is no James Madison, and Tim knew James Madison. So
there goes our chance. There goes our chance with getting a sponsorship. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Yeah. No, I just think the irony of us railing against technology, or me railing against technology and being involved in this project, which in my defense, we all have built up a lot of social capital before we started doing this, digital project. So we've been at each other's backyards and porches, and so I'd like to think there's a lot of social capital there that precedes this platform. Yeah, I think first of all, David, these questions were really these were very thought-provoking. And I appreciated them, and I know that maybe some students and teachers are going to look at this and go like, what are they even looking at the national question? What is going on? But I think this might bear repeating, because we've said this occasionally, but I think at this point it may be important for us to say, look, teachers and students, we've always said that this project is to talk really about the follow-up phase. The kinds of things that you need to kind of tuck in your head that prepares you for the follow-up question phase. We've always said that, if you're coming here to get, your 4-minute presentations done, you'll be sat repeatedly every week, disappointed. But David has constructed some really thought-provoking, big idea questions. And I think And I think that's the beauty of the last hour that we've had. There's one organization I stumbled across this morning, and I'll put it in the sources. It's called the Civic Capital Index Report. It is a fantastic, I mean, it's like 40 pages, and it gives these indicators of what's a good, to Mike's point, what's social capital, and how do you gauge it? How do you figure out communities that have this? And their report focuses on, I don't know, 4 or 5 communities around the country where they've used their rubric and have made conclusions. So it's a really great site that, I mean, I hate to admit it's presentism, but it's really pretty cool. Take a look at it.
I just have a sense when he says he's going to put it in his resources, gentlemen, it's quite possibly he's already done that. So, Professor Kavanaugh.
Wait a minute, I gotta get something off Tim's nose there. I'm not quite sure what that is.
He's the.
It was a slow day. It was a slow day in the primary document world today. All right, leave me alone.
Yeah, well, I'm going to echo what Tim said as far as David's questions, because I think his questions are much more entertaining than the actual question that you have to answer. Because the main question is redundant. I think there's certainly a level of redundancy between the boldface and the first bullet. It's basically the same question, but anyway, good luck with that. But don't for the students, don't get caught up in the idea of that. Well, yeah, Alexis de Tocqueville is all that in a bag of chips, right? He's not necessarily. And the idea is and this goes back to David's first question, which is fantastic, is our first series of questions. He's writing in the what he sees in the 1830s. Does what he see in the 1830s have a relevancy to your world, students, in 2024? I'm not sure that it does. I mean, some of his thoughts on democracy and where it may be going, and the fear of majority tyranny, we see play out in American history all the time, or we have at least. I think, especially under Jim Crow. But don't get caught up in the idea that you have to think that, oh, well, Alexis de Tocqueville, we're putting him right next on the pedestal with Madison and Hamilton. Don't do that. I mean, if you find problems with it, take him to school. Call yourselves a bus driver, because you're going to take him to school on it. So don't think you have to be enamored with this guy, because you'll find plenty of critiques, which I'll add a couple in the resources when I add them.
Well, the only thing I can add is to Professor Moore's comments. That's probably the nicest thing he's said about me in the last 2 decades. So I'm announcing my retirement from the Constitution of American Life, because you always leave things on a high note. That's generally my philosophy there. So, hey, it's been a good time. Bye. Anyway, hopefully we've shined some light, and I do appreciate Professor Moore's reinforcement of what we are here to do. And hopefully we've given you some things to think about. In our next episode, we're going to turn to Justice Brandeis and his observation, another observation about America, but from someone who lives in this country, about the role of state governments in the laboratories of democracy. So until then, we wish you a good day, good week. Peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye.